James, talk about your story a little bit, and you recovered from cancer, told your story in a book. How did you find out that you had cancer? I guess start there.
Well, you know, I was living in Texas, and this was in 1985, and I was living on a beautiful little farm. I had a wife, I had a beautiful little daughter, and I had very successful businesses for a young guy. I was very ambitious, and I worked hard, and I was even in very good physical fitness shape. And I was one of these guys you'd see running down the highway, you know, and I worked out in the gym 2 or 3 times a week, and I ran, and I got into this running because I had a lot of death in my family. My mother died before I was even 2 years old, and my father died at the age of 46 of a heart attack. My grandfather, which I never knew, died at the age of 36. And I even had a little brother that died at the age of 8. So I saw a lot of death, and I thought that if I didn't get myself somehow or another into shape and start exercising more and take care of myself a little more, then I might be the next one. So I got into this running, I was exercising, and I was successful. And I was a follower of a guy back then. His name was Jim Fixx. And Jim Fixx was a running guru. He was one of the guys that started the fitness, well, one of the guys that was kind of responsible for the fitness, the running craze back in the 80s. And anyway, I kind of got into his idea that if you ran and exercised, you didn't have to worry too much, you know, and you could eat just about anything you wanted. That's what I did. Now, I thought he was doing the right thing, and one day I went into my office and I sat down and I grabbed a newspaper in the morning, had a cup of coffee, and I read in the headlines, Jim Fixx, running guru, dies while running, while jogging. And he just fell over on the side of the highway and died. And it just knocked me out of my chair. I think I spilt my coffee, and I was just shocked. I didn't know what to think. Here's this guy that I was looking up to, and now look at him. You know, what am I going to do? Am I going to keep doing what I'm doing? Should I figure something else out? Should I go get checked out? What should I do? So I decided to get one of these cardio stress tests, and one of these tests where they get you on a treadmill and see how high your heart can get and see how quick you recover. So I went into a specialist to get this done, and I go in there, and the specialist says to me, he says, you know, you're in tremendous shape. He says, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. He says, I think you broke the record. I think that in my office, I don't think anybody's done this well. He said, you know, you're the picture of health. You're going to live a long time the way you're living right now. And he says, on the way out the door, he says, there's only one thing I can find after a very thorough examination of everything. He says, there's only one thing I can find. He says, there's a mole on your back. He says, that mole looks a little different than the other moles. He said, it's probably nothing. But if I was you, I'd just, when you get a chance sometime, go down to the dermatologist. There's one down here in the hall, down the hall. And he says, he could look at it and tell you if it's anything to be concerned about. So I didn't think much about it, and a few weeks later I went in to see this dermatologist, thinking that it was going to be nothing to it. I go in there, and the dermatologist says, well, let's see what you got, take your shirt off and all that. I sat down, and he looked at my back, and he about had a fit in that office. You know, he started running around like he'd won the lottery. And he says, oh my God, I think you have melanoma. I mean, here he's going on, he didn't even know for sure, but it looked like it to him, and he really got excited. I've never been around a doctor got so excited about finding something like that. So it scared the heck out of me, I'll tell you. Here I am, a guy that thought he had life by the tail, and now he's got melanoma possibly. And I mean, I just probably turned pale white, and you know, he went on and on about how he might have to remove a large portion of my back or all that kind of stuff, you know, the tissue, and do some surgery immediately and all this kind of stuff. Well, I didn't like his bedside manner, so I got up and I said, I'll see you later and I'll get back to you. And I went home. I ended up going to get another opinion from another dermatologist that I had seen before, by my wife's suggestion, which was a good one to do, so I got a second opinion. And then this doctor says, well, let's go ahead and let's send you over to a friend of mine as a world-renowned oncologist. He said, this guy's going to know, if anybody would know, he's the guy to go to. And he said, it's probably nothing to this, but let's go send you on over there. So I went to this world-renowned oncologist. And I thought, well, I guess if you have to look at something like this, let's go to the best person. So I went to see him, and he says to me, well, looks kind of suspicious to me also. He said, but the only way we're going to really know is let's just remove it, and let's see exactly what it is, and I'll send it into the lab, and I'll call you back in a week or so. And he said, don't worry, there's nothing you can do. Well, all I did was go home and worry. I couldn't sleep. I was walking around on pins and needles, you know, just not knowing. So I went home, and I was a wreck, and you know, I just didn't know what to do with myself. So he calls me up, and it was almost 2 weeks later. So after 2 weeks of, you know, dancing around in circles, he calls me. He says, I got some good news and I got some bad news. One of those kind of calls. And he says, the good news, he says, is you got melanoma. And I thought, good news? How can that be good news? He says, but wait a minute. He says, we think we got it all. We think we got it all in that area, around that perimeter area that we took the incision. He says, so that's really good news. And hopefully it hasn't spread, and we don't think it has. He said, the bad news is that it's very deep. Very deep level means that it is stage 4. And he says that's not the best stage to have, because chances are it's going to spread to some other part of the body. And he went on to tell me, he says, we're going to have to keep an eye on this. We're going to have to really have you come in for regular checkups every 3 months or so. He says there's nothing else you can do. He said just live your normal life, go back to work, don't worry, all that stuff. Well, all I did was worry again. And it just scared the daylights out of me, this whole thing. Now I had melanoma, and my ambitious mentality went down the drain. I didn't care anymore, and I knew that you know, that I most likely this thing was gonna show up again, just from what I had read. But long story short, after a couple of these 3-month checkups, I found a lump in my growing area. It didn't seem right, and I went into the doctor, and he wanted to remove it and put me in the hospital. So he did. He went in, he did surgery, and he thought it was not going to be much to the surgery. But when I woke up in the recovery room, I knew I was in trouble, because it was this huge, you know, bunch of bandages and everything, and I was laying there, and as soon as I kind of woke up good, here comes the doctor in, and he says, well, he says, I'm sorry to tell you, James, he says, but the cancer has spread. It spread to your lymphatic system. And he says, you know, I hate to tell you this, but you're going to need to do 80 chemotherapy treatments. He says, I want you to do experimental chemotherapy, because the type of regular chemotherapy that most people do does not respond very well to this kind of cancer, and this is an aggressive kind of cancer. So he went on to tell me, he says, that's all I know to do. And he says you also have a 20% chance of surviving 3 to 5 years. He says, if you can get through these treatments. Because he was going to spread this out every 2 months. I'd do 5 treatments, because it was pretty tough stuff. And it was going to take me 2 months to recover from 5 treatments. So after I recovered from the surgery, then I would go in and start doing this chemotherapy. Well, after this diagnosis and this 20% chance of surviving, it kind of floored me, and I knew that there had to be a better way for me. And I decided that I had to find something, because I didn't want a 20% chance of living 3 to 5 years if I could get through these treatments. So what did I do? I started to pray, because I got a message on the phone from a minister of mine. It was a minister where I went to church. he told me on the phone, he had been praying for me. He knew I was a tough guy. I was the kind of guy that could push myself. And from all the running I did, he says, look, he says, if anybody can beat this, you can. He says, you go out there and you fight like hell, and I want you to beat this cancer. And it got my attention the way he put it. And it really made me start to think. So I started that prayer. And I started to pray harder than I've ever prayed in my life. And I prayed probably 100 times harder than I ever prayed. Like every cell in my body was praying. And when I got through with that prayer, I got some action started to happen. And about 20 minutes later, I had a friend of mine I hadn't seen in 7.5 years. He walks through the door. And he comes in, he had some papers in his hand. And he says, look, he says, I heard about a guy. I heard you were in here, first of all, and from an old friend of ours. And he said, I heard from a friend of mine at work about a guy that wrote a book, and it's about him healing himself with this diet and lifestyle. And he said it was about a guy that used a macrobiotic diet to heal himself. Well, I never heard of macrobiotics. Where I come from, you know, you go to the doctor and that's all you know, and whatever he says you do. So I got very excited because I could relate to this guy, and I had him go out and get this book, and I read it and I couldn't put it down. And I read that book, and that day he went out and got that book for me, and he found it. And I was excited because now I felt like this was my prayer being answered. And I thought that if it would work for this guy, why wouldn't it work for me? So I had one more knock the next day on the door. It was an interesting thing. It was 3 days in a row. I had these 3 knocks on the door, 3 visitors, three messengers, whatever you want to call it. It was a guy that brought me a book about vitamin C and cancer by Linus Pauling. And it was a very, very interesting thing because it talked about people that have been had late-stage cancer that were basically terminal that did very well with high-dose vitamin C. And they said that in the book that these people would stick around a long time. Some of them got well. I thought, well, if it'll work for them, it'll work for me. So why won't it? So I had these messengers, and I had one more the next day that came in the door, and it was a psychotherapist that had heard I was depressed, you know, and thought he could help me. He comes in, he says, look, I heard you were depressed, and I'd love to help you out. Is there something we can talk about, or when can we talk? So he came in, and we started to talk, and I said, have you ever heard of macrobiotics? He says to me, he says, hold on a minute. He went over the door, and he shut the door tight. Came back, sat down next to me. He says, I have heard of macrobiotics. He says, but I'm not going to tell you what I know until you promise that you don't tell anyone of our conversation. He says, I don't want to lose my job, my pension, and all that. I've been here 25 years or so. So he said, well, you promise me. And I said, you bet I'll promise. So he started telling me all this good stuff about people he had heard about, had done well on this diet, and that it was very good for healing, but you had to do it the right way. There's a right way and a wrong way. And he says, I think you could do it. You seem like you're actually not depressed anymore. And he says, you seem like you're excited about something, which I was, because now I had this hope of starting to believe that I could get better. And he says to me, he says, I think you're the kind of guy that could do this. So that really confirmed those other 2 things, and the things that I thought that I could do also, and it made me very excited, and you know, it gave me really a lot of hope, and eventually that's what I did, and you know, it was an amazing thing for me.